White opening d4 c4. This is the Queen's Gambit, made famous worldwide by the Netflix series The Queen's Gambit in 2020, but played by chess champions for over 100 years before that. Today, we learn what it is, why it works, and how to play the Queen's Gambit. So what really is the Queen's Gambit? It is a gambit in chess, or what really is a gambit? A gambit in chess means offering a pawn or any piece to gain a positional or developmental advantage. So the question with the Queen's Gambit is white actually giving the c4 pawn. So I'm going to show us how to play the Queen's Gambit now. White starts with d4 and black respond with d5. Afterwards, black plays c4, offering this pawn on c4, which is hanging, for white to capture. So this is the gambit. White is offering a free piece for black to capture. But that is the question. Is white actually offering that c4 pawn away for free? If black accepts the gambit by playing d4 takes d5 takes c4, then we call that the Queen's Gambit accepted. Black is going to have an extra pawn, but can black actually keep this extra pawn? Now, if you look at this position, black has already captured white c4 pawn for free. And is the pawn just going to go away like that? But white is then going to respond by playing e4. Beautiful move. This is the Queen's Gambit. White plays e4, grabbing the complete control of the center. Now, black pawn is on c4, is still under an attack. Immediately, black plays e4 because the bishop on f1 threatens to capture the pawn on c4. If black tries to hold on to the pawn by playing b5 or a5, this move is going to create a lot of weaknesses. And if black gives the pawn back, white has tremendous control of the center. Again, black shouldn't try to defend by playing d5 because that is going to be a lot of disadvantage to the position of black. And immediately black leaves this c4 pawn for the bishop on f1, white is in total control of the center by all of its pawns. This is the Queen's Gambit. And this is why the Queen's Gambit is not really a gambit in the true sense, because white almost always gets back the pawn on c4. In fact, with interest, the c4 pawn is offered as a bait to get a stronger central position. It is not a true sacrifice. In fact, it is not a free piece to just be taken. Now let's talk about what I casually mentioned: the Queen's Gambit accepted and the Queen's Gambit declined. Immediately white plays c4 after black's move d5. Black has two responses. The first one is the Queen's Gambit accepted. d4 takes c4. We call this the Queen's Gambit accepted. The black pawn takes the pawn on c4, and as we saw it, white gets back with strong central position. The position becomes open and active. So this is the Queen's Gambit accepted, where white plays this, total control of the center, and ready to capture back the pawn on c4 with interest. Right? So this is the Queen's Gambit accepted. Black upping to capture the c4 pawn. And then we have the queen's gambit declined. Black responds by playing e6, not capturing the c4 pawn, but waiting if white is going to capture the d5 pawn and then plays e6 in order for the e6 pawn to capture back, where black is still in control and still trying to take control of the center. So after pawn takes, there is a pawn to take back, and both of them are still contending for the central position for the queen's gambit declined. So it is only a reinforcement that black has done. Rather than capturing the c4 pawn, black reinforced the d5 pawn by defending it with e6. The queen's gambit declined is the most popular and most solid response. Black did not give anything but only built a very solid position. So if the queen's gambit is declined, white puts the bishop on g5. So in this position like this, we have a move like this: knight c6, bishop here, knight f6, most of the positions. But in a queen's gambit declined, this knight on c6 does not belong on c6. This knight belongs on d7, and that is the response of black to queen's gambit declined. White puts the bishop on g5, pinning the knight. This is an important move for the queen's gambit. It pressures the d5 pawn indirectly and creates tension. White will look to exchange the bishop for the knight, doubling the black's f pawn, or maintain the pin as long as possible. So what we have here is a situation where after this d4, d5, and then queen's gambit offered, and black decide not to take back but decline the queen's gambit, then knight f3, knight f6, then this bishop belongs to g5. The bishop is doing a lot of things, putting pressure on this knight because this knight is serving as a support for the d5 pawn and pinning it down to the queen. And if eventually white decide to capture the knight and then black takes back with the pawn, black is going to have a double pawn. If you have not watched my video on different types of pawns, you can check it out where we talked about double pawn and so many other pawns. So black is going to have a double pawn in this situation, and maybe maintain the pin as long as possible. Then black is going to build a solid structure and prepare to fight back in the center. So most of the time, black is going to respond with this move, pawn to c5, trying to contest back for the center, ensuring white is also not controlling the center and bringing out the bishop. Again, the knight on b1 and b8 belongs to d7 in the queen's gambit declined. The knight on b8 belongs to d7. So there is something else we also need to talk about in the queen's gambit. It is another form of defense which black can use against the queen's gambit. For a queen's gambit declined, after d4, d5, pawn to c6, then pawn to c4, then black respond with pawn to c6. We call this one the Slav defense. We call it the Slav defense, and it is the third response of black to the queen's gambit. So instead of the queen's gambit declined, where black ends up playing the e6 and the e7 pawn to e6, black decided to play c6. This defense for d5 and keeps the light square bishop free to develop to f5 or g4. When you play a move like e6, you've prevented this bishop from coming out, and you only not play it to d7 because that is where your knight is going to occupy. So most times you are only able to fianchetto your bishop by pushing your pawn to d6 and to b6 and playing your bishop to b7, or finding another way to bring out your bishop when you play the queen's gambit declined. But when you play this Slav defense by pushing your pawn to c6, then your bishop is able to come out here on g5 or f and on g4 or f5, where it can control a lot of squares. So this that we have here is the Slav defense. The Slav defense is a little bit active than the queen's gambit decline because black light square bishop has a lot of room. You can develop the bishop, just like I mentioned. You can develop the bishop and then take it out of the pawn chain, right? So the bishop is when it is queen's gambit decline, the bishop is blocked. The bishop is blocked for a queen's gambit declined, and then this bishop is not able to see the light of the day. And then you can play it to d7, just like I mentioned, because that is where your knight is going to occupy. So a lot of players love the Slav defense a lot, and it is because it is a very, very solid structure and you are able to still develop your light square bishop. So again, the question is, what is black's or white's plan in playing the queen's gambit? What exactly is white hoping to achieve? So the reason white is playing this gambit, pawn to c4, is to build a strong center and then use that center to restrict black pieces. The queen's gambit is a very open game because there's not a lot of blockage going on. Immediately black decides to accept the gambit and capture the pawn on c4, then white is in total control of the center with their pawns. What they just need to do is to develop the rest of their pieces, and then they are now totally controlling all of the center, the structure of the center, the dynamics of games in the center. So specifically, one of the reasons why white will decide to play the the queen's gambit is to control d4 and e4 with their pawn, and this is going to give them what we call the spatial advantage. It gives them more rooms for their pieces to operate, just like I've mentioned. Now white is controlling both d4 and e4 with their square, and also controlling the d5 and e5 square, ready to bring out their knight to support this control, and ready to bring out the knight to f3 as well to support this control. The bishop is also occupying c4. This bishop is occupying f4, and this is a lot of controls going on the board by white alone. So it gives white what we call a spatial control. The second reason is that white gets to develop the light square bishop actively. In the queen's gambit decline, white bishop is not able to go to d3, or might even occupy just d3 or d2, pointing at the king side. So when you have this queen's gambit decline where black decides not to capture and then plays this, right, then this bishop is going to come to, and when you eventually play a move like this, your bishop will come to d3 or d2, actively occupying a strong square, or you bringing it to f3 or g4, where it can also control a lot of squares. So in a queen's gambit, either declined or accepted, your bishop, the light square bishop, is able to actively control a lot of squares. Then the third one is that you create a minority attack on the queen side. So when you have your queen, your pawn gets captured at the king side, you definitely has fewer pieces at this side compared to your opponent, and then you can use this attack, you can use it by pushing your pawn to to b4, b3 to b4, then b5, and you can start an attack both the a2 pawn and the b2 pawn, and you can start an attack at the queen side, and then white advances the b pawn, the c pawns, to create a lot of weaknesses at the black's pawn structure. And then the fourth one is you use the central space advantage to generate a king side attack. Eventually, you'll be able to maneuver your bishop out or play your bishop as a fianchetto, and you can start launching an attack. Again, just like I've mentioned, if it was a queen's gambit um, accepted, and then you play a move like this, you get to develop all of your pieces. You get to develop all of your pieces. You develop all your pieces, you castle, and you just have a very nice position. And before you know it, you can start, a king side attack on the black side with all of your pieces. So this particular game or this particular opening is very, very strategic, and it's a long-term plan. You are not hoping for the immediate. The gambit there is just for your opponent to focus on taking a little pawn while you specialize in controlling the center. It is not about a quick attack. It is about building a positional superior game and outplaying the opponent over time. So this is the queen's gambit. D4, D5, C4, and then when knight takes and when pawn takes C4, queen's gambit accepted, you play E4. And when pawn does not take and they played E6, queen's gambit declined, you continue developing your pieces. Bring out your bishop to G5. So this is the queen's gambit. White offers the C4 to take control of the center position. And when black accepts by taking the C4 pawn, or they decline by playing E6 or the Slav defense C6, white's plan is to build a solid pawn structure at the center and use superior space for a strategic advantage. This opening is ideal for players who prefer strategy, positional plays in chess over sharp tactical battles. And now you know exactly what it is and why it has been played by champions for over a century. Tomorrow we learn chess rules, everything a young player needs to know before entering their first competition. Subscribe and I will see you then.